Okay, welcome back, everyone. It is 12:35, at least where I am on the West Coast, and we are back for the one to close out our summit with a really, really special guest and conversation. So, welcome back, everyone, to this very special segment of our summit. Today, we are incredibly honored to host a conversation with an exceptional leader whose dedication to empowerment, equity, and transformational change has left an indelible mark on Wisconsin and beyond. Mandela Barnes has spent his career working for Wisconsin's working people. He not only served in the Wisconsin legislature, which we love, but he also became the state's 45th lieutenant governor, the state's second ever Black statewide elected official, and ran a record-breaking U.S. Senate campaign where he came just 1 point away from unseating a two-term incumbent in Wisconsin's closest Senate election in 100 years. Determined to support other diverse and groundbreaking candidates across the country, Mandela founded the Long Run PAC, and he also returned to organizing as president of Power to the Polls Wisconsin, an organization dedicated to empowering underserved voters in the state. I am thrilled to welcome to the virtual stage for a fireside chat, a true advocate for change and former state legislator, Mandela Barnes.
Well,
Hello.
thank you. Hey. Thank you so much. It's good to see you. We finally got this figured out.
We did. I'm so glad. It's great to see you as well. I really just scratched the surface when it came to your bio. So I would love for you to just talk a little bit about, to start off by introducing yourself, talking a little bit about your story, and if you could also share what inspired you first to run for office.
Well, absolutely. Again, just want to say thanks for having me. And I want to first say that if it weren't for my personal story, I wouldn't have been elected to the state legislature, would not have been elected lieutenant governor, would not have had the foundation to run for the United States Senate. And I'll say that because specifically, my background is different than a lot of other folks in the United States Senate. My story is a very Wisconsin story. It is a very working class story. And it's a story that many people relate to. It's how I was able to transcend a lot of the boundaries and cross a lot of the divisions and able to get over some of the humps and hurdles that many had not been able to in the past. So I was born and raised right in the heart of the city of Milwaukee. And although majority of the state of Wisconsin is not an urban center like the city of Milwaukee, so many people can relate to the fact that my mother, was a public school teacher. My dad worked third shift on an assembly line, and it was their union jobs that gave us a ticket to the middle class. My parents worked incredibly hard to make sure that I had the best future possible in front of me, and they always kept me engaged in civic activity. My parents would take me to every election. My dad would make me get a sample ballot just so I could be familiar with the process to know how things worked, know the process, and I could become familiar with names. But I didn't necessarily see myself pursuing a career in politics from a young age. I didn't think that was for me. I didn't think it was something that was meant for me to do. I, could see people running for office, but not necessarily a bunch of people who shared a story like mine or looked familiar who were sitting in those seats of power. But I went to college at Alabama A&M University in Huntsville, Alabama. My major was broadcast journalism, and I was very young when I started. I was pretty young when I started college. I was 16, but in 2004, I saw Barack Obama, like so many other people, for the first time give his historic DNC speech, and that's what inspired me. That's what encouraged me to get involved, to get engaged. And I didn't change my major, but I didn't go into a career in broadcast media. I ended up becoming a field organizer right out of college, working on a congressional race in rural Northwest Louisiana. That is where I cut my teeth. That's where I became familiar with organizing as a tactic, but also organizing as a way to get involved in politics. And I always credit, that speech that Barack Obama gave with encouraging me and inspiring me to get involved. I got back to Milwaukee, got into issue-based organizing with an interfaith social justice group, and then I ran for the state assembly 3 years later. Successfully ran for the state assembly 3 years later.
That that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And that speech is definitely a moment that I think a lot of us remember. And so it's really great to hear you talk And interesting to hear you talk about your kind of unconventional background as well as an elected official. And so, could you talk a little bit about sort of what barriers you faced as you were running and making that decision, and what or who helped you overcome some of those barriers?
And it's so wild that we talk about it as an unconventional background. And I remember 2008 when we had the youngest members of Congress at that point elected. We had the most diverse members of Congress. We had the most women elected to Congress at that time in 2018. And everyone's like, "Oh, all these unlikely candidates." So I'm like, "These are the most likely Americans, right? These are the most conventional Americans. These are the people you're going to run into at the post office, the people you run into at the grocery store, people you go to school with, work with." And it's unfortunate that our government, our politics in general, don't truly represent the whole of America. And so when I think about certain hurdles, certain barriers, when I got elected to the state assembly, I can't say I necessarily fit in, but I did know that I was fortunate to be there, and I knew that there was work to do, work because it needed to be done, and also the work to prove a lot of people wrong. So you have to look at it from both sides and recognizing how our biggest challenges rarely have the people who have experienced those challenges at the decision making table. And that was an understanding that kept me in the fight for better for everybody. I had the opportunity to travel across Wisconsin, all across this, excuse me, sorry, it's starting to become allergy season. It's to get the flowers and stuff blooming a little earlier than planned. So we had to, fight against climate change. But I had the opportunity to travel all across Wisconsin. I got an opportunity to share my story, and I heard so many people share their experiences that were so similar to my own, or so similar to the ones that I had known firsthand with people I went to school with, people in my neighborhood, my family members. But one thing, in politics is that it feels that too many of our elected officials not having shared that common American experience, shared the experience of struggle. Not to say that everybody in Congress or everybody in the United States Senate has to have had struggle in their lives, but we do need a more proportionate amount. I recall being at a meeting that was a poverty on some, or excuse me, a summit on poverty, and we went to breakout sessions. I tell this story all the time because it still perplexes me. In this meeting, in the breakout groups, I was pretty familiar with everybody else sitting around. So I said, well, I don't know any of y'all to be broke. And I just asked the question. I was like, how many people at this table have experienced poverty in the last 10 years at least? And nobody raised their hands. I was like, well, it's great that we're here, but I can tell you right now, we're not going to do a lot of problem solving because none of us can speak firsthand to the issue. And so when I think about the burdens, the hurdles that people have to get over traditionally, even for the legislature, so many people come in who are independently wealthy, have a side job. I was at a point where, I was lucky that I was 25 when I ran for the state assembly, where I didn't have any real bills, right? I didn't have any real responsibilities, no real financial burdens. So that allowed me to go ahead. But I think about, at this age, at 37, if I were to run for the state legislature, I don't know that I can make the sacrifice to take a job that, doesn't pay so well, especially as, we try to, as I'm thinking more about my own financial future and things I should have done when I was younger, but taking sacrifices like organizing jobs doesn't lend itself to create a solid foundation. So that is also another hurdle. I didn't work when I ran for the state assembly. I was, the organization I was, that employed me is a 501(c)(3), and I couldn't run for partisan office as an employee of this organization. So I had to leave, and I was fortunate that I had a place to stay, a house that's still in the family now, but everybody doesn't have that. Everybody doesn't have those sort of support systems. So in order for not just me, but all of us to be able to create a system of government that's more reflective, we got to think about the entry points because they are closed off to far too many people.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Thank you for sharing that. And I mean, What a story. And it reminds me, this morning we talked to Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs, and she shared her experience as well of also not always in her past being able to make ends meet, growing up in a family where that was the case, and how it really informed her ability as well. And it's just a powerful reminder that we need people who are coming from this diversity of backgrounds so that we've got that kind of representation.
Yeah.
So of course, you served as a state legislator, and as lieutenant governor, you also worked with the state legislature. So I'd love for you just to talk a little bit more about that experience and what you learned from it about the role that state legislatures play in our democracy.
I have so much appreciation for state legislative bodies across the country. When I was in the state legislature, that was the same time that Governor Hobbs was in the state legislature. We were members of an organization called SIX, which is State Innovation Exchange, an organization I eventually ended up working for at one point. And having those networks truly brings out the best. Especially people in states where it is difficult. Wisconsin, very, very deep in the minority right now because of gerrymandering. We do have new maps in Wisconsin. It is a new day in the state. We will have a much better shot at getting some parity in the state legislature. But that wasn't the case when I served 11 years ago. It was a place where bad ideas went to die. It was a place that was so very disappointing for so many reasons because the will of the people was never truly reflected, was never truly realized. But I think about issues like childcare, issues like education, when I was organizing our issues with jobs and economic development, education, immigration reform, and treatment instead of prison, those are four issues that the state legislature had a significant role in. And, not so much immigration, but a couple issues like in-state tuition, regardless of, where you were born. If you graduated from a high school in the state, you should be able to pay in-state tuition to go to a university in-state, or driver's licenses, regardless of your status. We have a lot of people who work, especially in rural communities where you have to drive a car, and they aren't afforded the necessary documents to be able to get to and from work, thus creating a very dangerous situation because if you got a license, you can't get car insurance, and it creates so many other cascading problems. Environmental issues, right? All these things are impacted at the state level. States have so much autonomy, and if we don't have strong state legislators and state legislatures that are responsive to the people, the things that happen in the federal government won't matter. We're fortunate that we have the governor's office right now in Wisconsin, but having served as lieutenant governor, it was a headache knowing that we won every statewide office in 2018, but came away with about 36%, 35% of the seats in the state house, about the same in the state senate. And so no matter what bold ideas we put out there in our state budget, because that's where we had to do a lot of legislating from or attempted legislating from, those ideas went to die. And these are things people in Wisconsin are overwhelmingly supportive of. We're one of like 10 states that has yet to expand our Medicaid program under the Affordable Care Act. Universal background checks supported by a majority of Republicans across the country and in Wisconsin. Issues like taking bold action on the climate. These things have been consistently ignored by the state legislature, and there's a lot of power as well. And over the course of the last 5 years, what Republicans in the legislature and the state Senate specifically have done is when they disagree with one of the governor's appointees, and they've done this with a couple cabinet secretaries, and they're coming for a couple members of the Board of Regents right now, is they'll just remove them from office. They'll take a vote and they'll remove them from their positions, from their appointed position. So there's a lot of power. And when somebody is doing the right thing, showing up, actually delivering for the people, Republicans have consistently stood against it. And that's why having fair maps matters so much. That's why having maps that are not gerrymandered, that truly let people get to pick their representatives, is ultimately how we save our democracy.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. And speaking of fair maps, you mentioned that there are some new maps, which is just so incredible. As background for anybody who hasn't been following along, Judge Protasewicz won her victory in 2023 last year. And as a result, it unlocked this possibility that we might get fair maps in Wisconsin. And we, in fact, did. Governor Evers signed these into law just a few weeks ago. So I would love to hear from you. What is it like? What's the feeling on the ground right now with these new maps? And what are some of the new possibilities going to be like with them in place?
There is a lot of possibility. There's a lot of excitement. I was actually at a gala last night, very non-political gala. Actually, it was Girls on the Run, if that's an organization that is out there. So I have a number of friends who are on the board. I run a lot myself, as some may know. But one of my buddies was there. His wife is very involved in the organization, but he is a personal friend. He's also a decent donor in the state, and he was just talking about how he's told the top of the ticket candidates, the statewide candidates, that he's not giving to them. He's putting all his money in the state legislative races. So people are very, excited about the prospect. And one thing I'll say is, the excitement itself carries you a long way. The excitement itself is not going to win. You still got to have, good candidate recruitment strategies, and also good candidate support systems, which has been a little tough in the past, certainly here. But a part of that too is how despondent people have felt going into these races, or the lack of enthusiasm that people have had for state legislative races, given how the maps look. But now people are all in on the possibility of us getting the majority, or at least coming significantly closer than we have in previous election cycles. My race, I lost by 26,000 votes. That's 1%. There is no reason why our maps are so disproportionate. And so those priority issues, those things that people have been denied for like the last 15 years, public transportation funding, funding for clean, safe drinking water, the things you think should be basics, the things that you would assume anybody who's in elected office would be in a rush to support because they're wildly popular. They have been ignored. But Bob LaFollette said the will of the people should be the law of the land, and it has not been the law of the land sometimes. So we are very bullish about what we can do this November, but it's going to take a lot to get it done. Nothing will be handed to us.
No, that's right. Well, but I love to hear that this message about state legislatures, and people are really beginning to see this importance and ready to embrace the possibilities in Wisconsin, the opportunities of which are just truly generational, once in a lifetime kind of thing. So, okay, we obviously love state legislatures, and I have a lot more that I want to ask you about them, but I am going to make an understatement here, which is that Wisconsin it's going to be an important presidential battleground as well. So I'm curious, from you, as you look around the country to the recent primary results, some of which give some pretty concerning signals about Democratic voter enthusiasm. So what's your take, and how are you all thinking about turning out voters in Wisconsin?
So my take, I'll piggyback off one of the things I said, is Bob LaFollette mentioned, the will of the people should be the law of the land. Just because, we have good ideas as progressives, as liberals, as Democrats, however you want to frame it, just because we have good ideas as people who are deeply involved in these spaces, does not mean we get to ignore the grassroots. And we have been in scenarios too often where that has been the case, where we have refused to listen, or we have, ignored, we've ignored a lot of what the public has been saying. And, this moment is no different. We have to take into account people's concerns, especially our base. We have forsaken our base time, before in the past, in the not so distant past. I think about, 2016, it's not to put anything on any specific candidate. I'm talking about as a whole. In 2014 in Wisconsin, I do not remember. I have no clue what our message was in 2014. In 2016, it almost feels the same way, at least in Wisconsin, where we didn't talk about a whole lot of issues or ways to improve people's quality of life, and we paid for it. And so, with that being the case, you have to listen. And the issues surrounding turnout In 2008, this is another story I tell about our organizing director. We went through our training. Most of people, it was their first job out of college. It was their first political job, first job in politics. And the organizing director said, "There's no such thing as an apathetic voter, just a bad organizer." And that is something I have taken to heart. That is something I do not forget until this day. Again, this applies to me as well. I think about, my own race. Like, I do wish turnout was higher, but I don't put that on the voters. I think about what I could have done differently and, hopefully get ready for whatever next go round may be. And you mentioned in the intro, and back in organizing, as president of an organization called Power to the Polls, we're focused on engaging Black, brown, working class voters all across Wisconsin. The organization started before I came on board in 22 when I was on the ballot. But then the opportunity to lead the organization came around. We drastically ramped up our efforts, went from just a Milwaukee organization to Milwaukee, Racine, Green Bay, a little bit of Appleton, and we are continuing to raise the resources to expand our operation. We have a specific target of about 250,000 voters across the state, in an effort to not overextend ourselves, to keep us as focused as we can possibly be, with a manageable population that will ultimately make the difference. And we're going to hit these folks 6, 7 times between last September, because we've been on doors in September, and election day. We know that showing up 90 days before an election, it's not as effective as it used to be. There was a time when that worked. But as information, flows, and as disinformation flows, it takes us, reaching out so much earlier, because once that disinformation gets into communities, it lasts. And for whatever reason, the bad information sticks around way longer than the good information or the credible information. And so what we're doing is having our organizers come directly from the communities that they are canvassing in. I've been out on doors with them, and I can tell you all the doors have not been great. And I do think that is actually a good thing, because we're not going into this thing blinded. We have real time, real world responses from people, but also a nice runway to assuage those concerns and to be able to provide credible information, to tailor our messaging around what people are already talking about and how they're talking about it.
So I that's perfect. A perfect segue to my next question, which was
Yeah.
about messaging. And so what are some of those? You said that some of the doors aren't always so good. And so what kinds of concerns are you hearing from people, or maybe not hearing from people? And what are some of the ideas for the messages going forward that are going to be effective?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, people just want to know, that you are looking out for them, how you're going to help them, and there are multiple ways you can get that message across. Um, I think about election cycles where we'll talk about issues in very broad terms, like healthcare. We need to expand healthcare. That's something, regardless of where you are on the Democratic spectrum, you agree with expanding healthcare options. Now, it may look differently, but when you talk about certain things specifically, and not saying that you should talk about different things in different communities, I never take that approach. But there are certain challenges, right? Like, we know that in Black communities, Black seniors are less likely to be able to afford prescription drugs. We talk about how Biden-Harris administration has worked to lower prescription drug costs. Instances of diabetes are also more prevalent in Black and brown communities. We talk about how the cost of insulin has been capped, because we know people and have met people on the doors in previous cycles who had to ration out their insulin. And these are things that are helping people in real time. And I'm actually going to do a very non-scientific focus group of just one person in the next couple of weeks. There's a buddy of mine I went to high school with. We are friends. He, always, had a sense of humor. So I felt very comfortable engaging him here. But on Facebook, like, he popped up with a Trump 2024 hat. And I'm just like, I was looking at some of the comments, right? Like, some random people in there, some people were celebrating it. Some people was like, yeah, and some people, were laughing it off. But I just messaged him, and I never message people on Facebook because I can't deal with it. It's too much, too overwhelming. But I did take a moment to message him, and I'm like, look, man, I'm not trying to change your mind. And, our little secret here between us, I'm absolutely trying to change his mind. But I said, look, man, I'm not trying to change your mind, but I am genuinely curious, like, why? Just why? And if you care to talk about it. And he's like, yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. And he says, he brought up some issues about, like, he feels that people were immediately vilifying and demonizing Trump, which may have had a reverse impact, and may have garnered some undue sympathy to him. He talked about some stuff about taking care of problems at home, and some of it was misguided, but it was these are his thoughts, and these are not his thoughts alone. And it's somebody I'm really going to be engaging in much deeper conversation with, just to know. And I'm fortunate that this is a friend of mine, and I can have that conversation. I can ask whatever question I want because we go back a long time, and we have been through a lot together. And hoping that there'll be a lot that comes as a result of it. But I do think there is a need for us to engage in those one-on-one conversations because they go pretty far. Relational organizing is going to be a very important and useful tactic for all of us this entire year, because when people hear something from someone they trust, it makes it that much more likely that they'll be sympathetic and understanding of the issues at hand. And throughout our conversations, I want him to have the most accurate information that he can possibly have. Whether or not he keeps that profile picture is up to him, but I want him to at least be very informed. And he is somebody, or I am somebody that he can trust. And we all have people in our lives that are somewhat similar, in certain instances that are similar, that we need to take full advantage of those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so easy to hide behind screens and just sort of assume things about people. But you're reminded in those moments where you can actually build those bridges, that there are still a lot of conversations that we can and that we need to have. So I want to make sure that we've got enough time for questions. And so this is, by the way, to the audience, please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat, and I will look and see if we have time to answer them. But I've just got one last question before I get to those. Actually, you know what? I want to save that question for the very, very end. So I'm going to hold that question. But let me ask you this one. Uh, so I want to know, you talked a little bit about Power to the Polls and the work that you do serving underrepresented voters, and some of the conversations that you're having. I'm curious, what tactics have you seen to be really effective in building that trust? Is it just the like showing up at their door over and over again? Are there kind of services you can provide, resources? What are the ways that your organization's really able to build those connections?
Absolutely. So one thing we were able to do, our doors in the fall were not necessarily partisan doors. They were actually some C3 doors we were doing. And it was simply just building relationships. And it was also talking about, well, a lot of it was Inflation Reduction Act, and how people can save money. How people can save money on their internet bills with the Affordable Connectivity Program, how people can, cut costs and have access to some tax breaks, tax incentives for some energy efficiency projects in the home, and again, those prescription drug issues as well. So it was building a rapport. It was asking questions, asking what was on people's minds, and taking the time to listen without saying, "Hey, well, hope you vote for Joe Biden." Right? Like it wasn't that. So people didn't feel any sort of pressure in those conversations, and that's what I think helped us, get in the door with a lot of people. I think we're getting close to 50,000 doors now, and we just hired another set of organizers. They're going to be out, and we'll be getting those numbers up very consistently over the next several months. And again, like, people don't just want to hear about, voting for somebody. They want to hear about, well, they want to be listened to. that's the other part. People want to be listened to more than talked to sometimes, especially those who are feeling as if, they don't want to show up to vote, or they don't want to show up and vote for the right person.
Yes, absolutely. When we've been doing some really exciting research here on this problem of down ballot roll off, where voters start at the top of the ticket and they don't complete their ballot. And that means thousands of people, in every state, all across the country, every year are voting for the top of the ticket and not voting for their state legislative races, which, when races, even at the statewide level, let alone at the state legislative level, and entire chamber outcomes can be determined by just a few thousand or a few hundred or a few dozen votes. This is a really big problem, and I raise it because one of the things that comes up a lot, especially for Democrats and women and people of color and young people, is they're scared of voting for somebody who might not share their values. They don't want to vote for the quote wrong person. And so it's really interesting for you to hear you talk about that, because it's something that we're looking at and trying to figure out how we can address it at a broad scale as well. So thanks for that. I do see one audience question in here that acknowledges that state legislators work at this state level, but curious from your perspective in the conversations you're hearing on the ground and all of that. How have international affairs? How's the war in Gaza? How are these things sort of impacting the conversations on the ground?
Yeah. Oh, it is absolutely impacting conversations in a real way. And it is also stopping conversations from happening. And this is something that, quite frankly, the White House needs to figure out if they, well, one, because they need to figure it out. Humanitarian crisis needs to be solved. But there's also the impact on, on the election, on their political future, right? Like, I think about, potential for different events that will or won't happen without disruption. People are rightfully justified, or are justified, in their frustrations. And if people feel ignored, that I can guarantee you they're not going to show the vote. Like, 18, 19% of uncommitted vote in Minnesota is not insignificant. Minnesota is a much closer state than people realize. 100,000 votes in Michigan, like, and I do, unfortunately, we do hear sometimes where people are like, oh, they'll come back. They're not going to vote for Trump. They're going to come back to vote for us. We went into 2016 with a whole lot of hubris, and we were humbled very quickly. And I hope and I pray that they are not going to repeat the same mistakes. And we go in to this election cycle just assuming people will get over something and not vote for it. The youth vote that carried Joe Biden to victory, the youth vote in Wisconsin, we had the highest youth voter turnout in 2018, or excuse me, in 2022, the highest youth voter turnout in the country at just about 49%. That will be eliminated if this isn't figured out.
Thank you. It's a sobering reflection, but thank you for sharing your insights there. Okay, so we do just have one more minute, and so I want to close out with this final question, which is just that here today we've got some of our most dedicated volunteers, folks who have been with us since the very beginning, since 2017, this whole journey that we've been on. And I think we all share a lot of excitement, even more so after hearing you speak. But I would love to hear a little bit as we, steel ourselves for the work ahead. What's something that gives you hope? How do you stay energized every day?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to thank all the volunteers for your hard work. I mean, these operations, these organizations, these campaigns, they don't function without the power of volunteers. And I think that's one thing that does keep me engaged. I think that's one thing that does keep me active and hopeful that there are so many people who are willing to give so much. And times where I feel frustrated or times where I feel I may want to check out, I always run into somebody who I've never met before. I've run into some young people, like really, really, like way too young to vote people, who give me hope and they encourage me because they're coming into this thing and they are involved only because they think things can change. They feel things can change. And I do believe that to be the case. And whenever I feel that sense of optimism start to dissipate, I try to get out and go to some events. Tonight, I'm speaking at the Winnebago County Dems. I'm in Oshkosh right now, speaking at their dinner, and it's the people that I run into that inspire me to stay in this because we are all in this together, and none of us are in this for ourselves. We're in this for the whole. We're in this for everybody around us, and I do truly believe that to be the case. And when I see somebody else putting it all out there, then I remember that I got another day left in me.
Well, thank you so much. We could keep talking forever. I would love to. But this, I think that's all the time we've got for today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You've been such
Thank
an
you.
inspiration. I've learned a lot. Anytime you want to come back and announce your next run for office, we're here for you. I'm very grateful for your time and your leadership. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate you. Thank you for
Thanks.
having me.
Bye. Take care.
Goodbye. You too.
Okay, so as we think about the work ahead, particularly now with the opportunities open in Wisconsin and beyond, as we just discussed, this work, I hope that you can feel it the way that I do. I know it's been a